I remember the exact moment I stopped being afraid of what they thought of me. It wasn't when I found out my daughter had been meeting my husband for lunch every Tuesday for 8 months and calling it errands. It wasn't when Glenn handed me the separation agreement across the kitchen counter like he was returning a library book, already looking past my shoulder at his phone. It wasn't even when Brooke stood up at my own kitchen table, the table I had refinished by hand the summer we moved in, sanding it down to bare wood in the August heat, and told me, in a voice so calm it almost sounded kind, that I should think about moving somewhere smaller, that maybe the house was too much for a woman my age to manage alone. It was the moment right after that, when my attorney, a woman named Patricia Osei, who had spent 30 years doing exactly this kind of work, and who I had never heard raise her voice unnecessarily, made a sound I wasn't expecting, not a gasp, not an objection, a small, contained exhale through her nose that somehow communicated more than a full sentence would have. And I watched Glenn's face. I watched that settled, certain expression, the one he had been wearing since he walked into that mediation room 14 minutes late with my daughter sitting right beside him. I watched it shift, just slightly, just at the edges, the way ice shifts before it cracks. My name is Lorraine Holt. I am 57 years old. And this is the story of the day. Two people walked into a room having already decided how it ended, and found out they had been reading the wrong document. Let me tell you what my life looked like from the outside. 31 years of marriage. A 4-bedroom colonial in Fairfield County, Connecticut. The kind of house that required constant quiet maintenance. The gutters every fall. The boiler inspected every March. The perennial beds along the front walk that I had planted and divided and replanted over 2 decades. Until they finally looked like something from the inside of a gardening magazine, which nobody ever noticed and which I had stopped expecting anyone to. Glenn was a structural engineer, regional firm, good reputation, 32 employees. He had built the practice from a 2-person operation in the mid-90s to something genuinely substantial, and he was proud of that, which was reasonable. He had worked hard. What the outside version of our life did not show was the inside version. Before Glenn, before Fairfield County, before the colonial with the perennial beds, I had spent 7 years working in estate and trust administration at a law firm in Hartford. Not practicing law. I was a paralegal, specifically, one of 3 people in a 12-attorney firm, who actually understood how the documents worked, what the language meant in practice, where the gaps were between what an estate plan said and what it would do when it was tested. I was good at it. I had a particular talent for reading the fine print that other people skipped, for following the numbered references in a trust document, all the way through to their actual legal consequence, for finding the thing nobody had checked in 11 years. That turned out to matter enormously. When Glenn's practice started growing, I stepped back from outside work. Not because he asked me to, not exactly, because the practice needed someone who could do what I could do. Read contracts. Catch errors in vendor agreements. Track the administrative infrastructure that kept 32 employees functioning. And I was already there. I knew the work. I knew how to read a document the way a document wants to be read. All the way through, with all the referenced attachments. What I did over the next 2 decades was not glamorous. It was insurance renewals and subcontractor agreements. And the professional liability policy that Glenn had not read past the first page. And that I had flagged twice before someone finally updated the coverage limit. It was the lease for the second office space, which I reviewed on a Thursday night at the kitchen table, and found a clause that would have cost the firm $11,000 annually in maintenance obligations that nobody had caught. It was the retirement account structures, the buy-sell agreement with Glenn's original partner, the long-term disability policy that I had insisted on in 2009. When Glenn had thought it was unnecessary, and which had paid out 18 months of coverage when he needed shoulder surgery in 2014. I never asked for credit. I thought I had something better than credit. I thought I had the life. Brooke came into my life when she was 4 years old, and Glenn and I were first married. His daughter from a previous relationship. Her mother had moved to Phoenix when Brooke was 6. And after that I was the one who was there. School conferences, orthodontist appointments. The year she had mono and missed 8 weeks of 9th grade, and I sat with her every afternoon, and helped her keep up with the coursework so she wouldn't fall behind. I loved her the way you love someone you chose. Not because you had to, because you decided to, every day, for a long time, until it stopped feeling like a decision and just felt like fact. I should have understood earlier that she had not made the same decision about me. I found out on a Wednesday in November. I had come home from a dental appointment earlier than expected, and Glenn's car was in the driveway at 2 in the afternoon, which it shouldn't have been. I want to be careful here about what I say and what I don't say. What I will tell you is that what I found when I walked into my own house removed all ambiguity. There was no alternate explanation available. And the feeling that moved through me was not the kind of feeling I had expected. Not cinematic. Not the thing they show in movies with the swelling music and the slamming doors. It was quieter than that. Flatter, like something structural had given way somewhere deep in a foundation and the surface hadn't caught up yet. Glenn saw me. His first expression was not guilt. It was calculation. The rapid, practiced recalibration of a man who has been surprised and is already building the next version of the story. Brooke looked at me from across the room. She was 41 years old and she looked at me the way a stranger would. Level, untroubled. And she said, in a voice that was completely, terribly steady. You knew this wasn't working, Lorraine. Some marriages run their course. The best thing you can do now is be gracious about it. I drove to a hotel in Stamford. I sat in the parking garage for 35 minutes before I could do anything. Then I called Patricia Osei, my attorney. My personal attorney, not Glenn's firm's attorney, not a shared family attorney. Mine. A woman I had retained 5 years earlier on the advice of a friend, who had gone through a difficult divorce, and who had told me, plainly, over dinner one evening, that every woman doing serious financial work inside of a marriage or a family business needed her own independent legal counsel. That advice, given over pasta on an unremarkable Friday night, turned out to be the most consequential practical guidance I had ever received. What followed was 9 weeks of quiet, careful, methodical work, while Glenn and Brooke moved through our social world, with the ease of people who believe the outcome is already settled. Appearing at the Fairfield holiday party together. Glenn telling mutual friends that we had grown apart. Brooke posting a photograph of the two of them at a restaurant in New Haven with a caption about family. Patricia and I were building something in the background. Not out of anger, not even out of hurt by that point. Out of precision. The mediation took place on a Thursday in late February, in a conference room on the 4th floor of a building in downtown Stamford. It was one of those days in late winter when the sky is completely white, and the light comes in flat and cold through the windows, and everything looks slightly overexposed, like a photograph taken with the wrong settings. The room had a long walnut table, 8 chairs, a credenza with a coffee service nobody was going to use, and a view of the parking structure across the street. Glenn arrived first. His attorney was a man named Douglas Firth, a family law specialist with a smooth, economical manner and a reputation for quick resolutions. He had reviewed the financial disclosure documents Glenn's side had prepared and had structured a settlement proposal that was, technically, defensible. Efficient, designed to be accepted by a woman who did not fully understand what she was entitled to, which is to say, designed to be accepted by someone who was not me. Brooke arrived with Glenn. She had no legal standing to be in that room. She was not a party to the proceedings. She was not represented by counsel in that session. She was there because Glenn had apparently decided her presence would be useful. And because Douglas Firth, to his credit, looked genuinely uncomfortable about it, but said nothing. She was dressed carefully. Dark blazer, good jewelry, the kind of put together that communicates confidence. She sat directly beside Glenn at the far end of the table, and placed her hands flat on the surface in a way that was clearly meant to look composed. Patricia and I sat across from them. Patricia placed a manila folder, plain, no colored tabs, nothing theatrical, flat on the table beside her legal pad and did not open it. The preliminary documents were exchanged. Douglas made his opening statement. He spoke about equitable distribution, about Glenn's central role in building the firm's value, about the natural end of a partnership that had simply run its course. He was smooth and he was thorough. And Patricia let him finish every single sentence. Then Brooke opened her handbag. I have thought about this moment many times since, and I still don't entirely understand it. Maybe she had been waiting for it. Maybe she had rehearsed it. The clean punctuation mark that would close this chapter on her terms. Maybe she simply could not sit in that room and let it end without making her presence mean something. She withdrew an envelope. She slid it across the table until it sat directly in front of me. "There's $500 in there," she said. Her voice was even, almost kind. "That's for moving expenses. We both know you don't have family nearby. This is just to make the transition easier." She let a beat of silence pass then. "We're done here, Lorraine. It's time to move on." The room went absolutely still. Douglas Firth stopped breathing visibly for a moment. It was not a dramatic reaction. It was the controlled, involuntary stillness of a man who has just watched his client make a significant unforced error and is rapidly calculating the cost. Glenn did not look at Brooke. He looked at the envelope. His jaw was set with the particular tension of a man who had not approved this and was not pleased. And Patricia Osei exhaled. That small, quiet, entirely genuine sound. The kind of exhale that comes not from surprise but from recognition. From the moment when something you have been waiting for finally arrives exactly on schedule. Glenn said, quietly but with an edge, "Patricia, something to add?" Patricia uncapped her pen, set it down on her legal pad. Then she picked up the manila folder and placed it in the center of the table, turning it so the document on top faced Glenn's side of the room. "I want to thank Brooke for that," Patricia said. Her voice was completely level. "That statement was made in the presence of both counsel and the mediator and will be part of the session record. I want to note for that record that my client does not require assistance with moving expenses." She paused, one beat. "Because my client is not the one who will be moving." Douglas leaned forward immediately. "That's a significant assertion. I'd like to understand the basis." "You're looking at it," Patricia said. "Here is what was in that folder." Glenn's practice, Holt Structural Group, had been incorporated in 1997. For the first 4 years, it was a sole proprietorship. Glenn was the company legally and practically. In 2001, when the practice had grown enough to require real administrative infrastructure, we had made a series of decisions together about how to formalize the business structure. Glenn handled the engineering. I handled everything else. What Glenn had apparently not revisited, in the 22 years since, was the precise language of the operating agreement we had executed in 2001. The agreement that established Holt Structural Group as a limited liability company with 2 members. Glenn Raymond Holt, holding 60% membership interest, and Lorraine Catherine Holt, holding 40% membership interest, with full rights to examine the books, participate in major decisions, and under the buyout provision that we had negotiated with the help of an attorney. Glenn had long since forgotten about. Receive fair market value for her interest, based on an independent valuation, in the event of dissolution of the marriage. Glenn had never updated that agreement, not in 2008 when the practice expanded. Not in 2015 when they brought on 4 new engineers. Not at any point in the intervening 2 decades, because the original document was in a filing cabinet in our home office that I had organized and maintained. And Glenn had not thought about it in years, and neither had Douglas Firth, because Glenn had not told Douglas Firth that the original operating agreement had a second member. Patricia slid the relevant pages across the table one at a time. "My client holds a 40% membership interest in Holt Structural Group," Patricia said. "That interest has never been transferred, never been dissolved, never been removed from the operating agreement. The firm's current valuation, based on an independent appraisal conducted 6 weeks ago by a certified business valuator, is attached as Exhibit B." She tapped the folder once. 40% of that number is a significant figure. It is separate from and in addition to the marital asset calculation your client has proposed. Douglas was reading, fast. The focused, rapid eye movement of an attorney who is processing information that restructures the case he thought he had. His expression was the controlled professional version of alarm, which is somehow worse to watch than actual alarm, because you can see the person managing it. Glenn had gone very still. Not the restless, impatient stillness of a man waiting for his moment. The rigid, breath-held stillness of a man receiving information that changes the floor he thought he was standing on. Brooke looked at Glenn, then at the documents, then at Glenn again. Her mouth opened slightly and closed again. For the first time in the 37 years I had known her, through childhood and adolescence and adulthood, and everything that had brought us to this particular table, she had absolutely nothing to say. "There is one additional matter," Patricia said. She withdrew a second document from the folder. In 2003, 2 years after the LLC was formalized, Patricia had advised me, on the basis of work I was already doing for the firm, to execute a formal consulting agreement between myself and Holt Structural Group, not as Glenn's wife doing administrative work as a favor, not as an informal contribution to the family business, as a contracted consultant with a defined scope of services, documented deliverables, and a compensation structure that had been set at below market rate at the time, and had accumulated, over 21 years of documented work, into an outstanding balance that represented a contractual obligation of the company. I had signed the original agreement without much thought. It had felt like a formality. A piece of paper in a drawer that Patricia had recommended, and that I had executed because Patricia was thorough, and I trusted her judgment. I had not thought about it again until 9 weeks ago. My client entered into a formal consulting agreement with Holt Structural Group in February of 2003. Patricia said, "The documented scope of work over the subsequent 21 years includes contract review and vendor management, professional liability insurance administration, office lease negotiation, and general administrative services. The estimated value of services rendered, calculated at current market rates for the documented hours, is attached as Exhibit C." She looked at Douglas directly. "This is a contractual obligation of the LLC, not of Glenn Holt personally. It is enforceable independent of the divorce proceeding." Douglas asked for a recess. Patricia gave him 25 minutes. During those 25 minutes, Brooke did not say one word to Glenn. She sat with her hands in her lap, looking at a point somewhere beyond the window. The envelope was still sitting on the table in front of my place. Nobody had touched it. I looked at the parking structure across the street. I looked at the flat white February sky. I thought about the kitchen table I had refinished in August heat, all those years ago. I thought about the perennial beds along the front walk, the ones nobody had ever mentioned. I thought about the professional liability policy, the lease clause that would have cost $11,000 a year, the buy-sell agreement with the original partner. All the things I had read all the way through. I did not feel triumphant. I felt, more than anything, very tired and very clear. When Douglas and Glenn returned from the hall, Douglas's posture had changed. "Not much. Enough. I won't walk through every line of what followed, partly because some of it is confidential and I am content to leave it that way. What I will tell you is what mattered." Glenn retained full operational control of Holt Structural Group and his 60% membership interest. He kept the title and the business cards and the firm he had spent 30 years building. What he lost was the assumption he had been operating under, that the firm was entirely his to dispose of, that the settlement was his to dictate, that I was a woman who had been adjacent to his professional life rather than, in a legally documented and enforceable sense, part of its structure. My 40% interest was addressed through a buyout, calculated from the independent valuation Patricia had commissioned. The consulting agreement balance was settled separately. The total outcome was not what Glenn's team had proposed in their initial offer. It was not close to what they had proposed. The Colonial is on the market. I chose to sell it. I don't need 4 bedrooms and I find that, now that the decision is mine, I don't particularly want them. I am looking at a house in West Hartford. Closer to the city, smaller, with a kitchen that has good light in the mornings, and a backyard that is small enough to actually manage, and which I intend to plant with whatever I want without consulting anyone. Brooke left the building before the final signatures. I did not watch her go. I heard the door. I heard, through someone we both know from the years when all of this was different, that Glenn and Brooke ended 6 months after the settlement. No announcement, no public rupture. It simply stopped the way things built on a miscalculation eventually stop. Without ceremony, Glenn called me once, about 2 months after everything was finalized. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail that I listened to once and deleted. I don't know what I would have said back, and I've made peace with not knowing. Patricia sent me a handwritten note when the settlement was complete. She said she had rarely seen a client as prepared as I was. I thought about that for a long time. I hadn't thought of myself as prepared success. I had thought of myself as someone who read the documents, who followed the references all the way through, who understood that the fine print is not fine print. It is the whole print. It is the actual meaning, and the people who skip it are the people who eventually sit across a walnut table in downtown Stamford in late February and learn that the story they were telling was not the complete story. I live differently now, quieter in some ways, louder in others. I consult occasionally, independently, for people who need someone to read a contract the way a contract wants to be read. All the way through, with all the attachments, following every reference to its actual consequence. I am good at it. I have always been good at it. I was good at it long before anyone thought to put my name on the door, and I will be good at it long after it ceases to matter whose door it was. Here is the thing about that envelope. The one Brooke slid across the table with $500 inside for my moving expenses. It sat there for the entire mediation session, through the recess, through the counter proposals, through the final signatures. Nobody picked it up. Nobody moved it. When Patricia and I stood to leave, I looked at it one last time. Crisp envelope, sitting precisely in the center of my place at the table. I left it there. Some things are not worth carrying. Brooke thought she was closing a door. What she didn't understand, what people like her almost never understand, is that the door she thought was closing had never been hers to close. The work happened before the room. The documents were in the drawer before the conversation started. The name was on the agreement before anyone decided it was convenient to forget it. She saw a woman who had been quiet for a long time, and decided that quiet meant empty. That decades of careful, unglamorous, meticulous work had left no trace worth accounting for. She was wrong about what the quiet meant. She was wrong about what had been built inside it. And Patricia Osei's exhale, that small, contained, genuine sound that filled that flat February silence before anyone else in the room understood why. That was the moment I knew the room had caught up with what I had been doing for 30 years. I want to ask you something before you go. And I mean it genuinely. Has there been a moment in your life when someone who should have known better decided they already knew your worth, and they were wrong? When the work you had done quietly, without announcement, without credit, without anyone watching, turned out to be exactly the thing that changed the story? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one, and if this one stayed with you, you know what to do. Subscribe to Selina Payback, a new story every single day.